When I was thinking about Kevin, and I have the problem, I have to correct myself already, Dean Worthen. It's like when you're in a ward and a good friend becomes a bishop or a good friend becomes a stake president, you kind of slip a little bit until you get used to calling him by the proper name. But Dean Worthen, my relationship with him kind of has different levels. At one level, it's we both love BYU sports, and we both detest most things University of Utah. So we're kind of kindred spirits on that. I was in the same class and also was in the same small section, which was civil procedure by Professor Worthen. And I was able to kind of see firsthand that there was a little bit of a difference between his brain and my brain. And later on in law school, Kevin, we gave him the name Zeus on leave from Mount Olympus. And we had an intramural basketball team that was in, I think, 5A or whatever, the highest category. And we were putting it together, and someone says, well, if we really want to win, we need Zeus on our team. So he played on our basketball team, and we actually won the highest category of intramural basketball, and we were all out of shape, third-year law students. But for some reason, in law school, Kevin and I went to some seminar up in Salt Lake. And I can't remember what it was for. I do remember Rex Lee speaking. And on the way back, we were talking, and we're talking about law school and everything like that. And Kevin said something to me that really caused me to reflect a little bit on my own life. And he probably doesn't remember this, but he said, he was talking about things that he was kind of feeling anxious about and things that he wished he could do better. And he said he wished he was writing more in his journal. And I thought, I haven't even thought about writing in a journal for years, since I was on my mission. So that tells you a little bit about what kind of a person Kevin is. Not only was he exceptional in law school, but he went on to clerk at the Supreme Court, went to work for a firm in Phoenix, and then ultimately came to BYU as a professor and is now the dean. For some reason, I got an email asking me to suggest somebody for the dean. And I don't know why it was sent to me. It could have been a mistake. You know how email is. It can be sent to the wrong people so easily. But I took a shot and I said, Kevin Worthen. And I said, I don't know much about his administrative skills because I hadn't seen them firsthand. But I do know that he will always do what the Lord would want him to do. And I think that that is the essence of Dean Worthen. I've seen him in a number of situations, and he has a great intellect, and he has a great capacity for understanding the mind and will of the Lord. I do know that one last thing is that when Kevin probably feels a little overwhelmed, that in the back of his mind, he probably realizes and remembers that in the first year moot court competition, he and Vern Broadbent lost in the finals to me and Evan Schmidt. So my career has been a little different than Kevin's, or Dean Worthen's, but I still have that going for me. And so without any more, Kevin Worthen.
Thank you, Bob. The only thing I question about that story about moot court is I'm not sure I made it to the finals at that point. First, let me thank everyone who's been involved with putting these conferences together, this leadership conference. I'm struggling to find out what to call this as we combine the two together. It is a remarkable thing. I'm reminded of a comment that Elder Eyring made one time. When he was Commissioner of Education, he was already an apostle and working with BYU. And talking about the things that were going on at BYU at one of these sessions, he said, you know, there's a part of me that just wants to retire and buy a home right across the street from campus and just sit and watch what happens. Obviously, it's not going to happen. He's not going to retire. But there's a part of me, after being with these two energetic groups and thinking of the law school and the three entities together, that just sort of wants to retire and buy a house right across from 9th East and watch and see the miraculous things that unfold. Because I don't think you can predict in advance what will happen with any of these organizations. We have some idea, but I think in the long run, we really don't have a full picture of all the good that's going to come out of this association that we have with each other. I want to visit a little bit today. I think the topic, as announced, and appreciate having printed programs, that gets me focused, are lessons on the life of J. Reuben Clark. We saw a wonderful DVD last night. I hope all of you, I do hope, I recognize that everyone did, but I hope all of you saw that last night or have an opportunity to see it. It's a magnificent production. And I'm actually going to refer to a couple of things, 3 or 4 things in there. This is a little bit like the rest of the story. Those of you old enough to remember Paul Harvey, some of the things that the DVD alludes to, but I want to elaborate on. As with all good productions that way, there's a lot more depth that's packed into there than most people realize. And I start off with something that Marion G. Romney said that's quoted in that DVD. The occasion was the dedication of the law school building in 1975. So this is when, by this time, the law school had been in existence 2 years, and President Marion G. Romney, who clearly was the prime mover behind getting a law school started at BYU, addressed the question about why the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would establish a law school. And he said, I don't know why others were involved, but I will tell you why I used my influence, and I will add it was considerable influence that he had to establish the law school. And he listed 4 or 5 things. The one that's relevant here is he said, I desired to have perpetuated on this campus the memory and influence of President J. Reuben Clark, Jr., a great lawyer, patriot, statesman, and church leader. It's my hope, he said, that all faculty and student body members will familiarize themselves with and emulate his virtues and accomplishments. I don't think I would be doing injustice to President Romney to suggest that that extends beyond students and faculty members of BYU, but all members of the J. Reuben Clark Law Society. That the challenge, not just the hope, is that we will familiarize ourselves with and emulate the virtues and accomplishments of J. Reuben Clark. It was with that in mind, quite honestly, that we began the project that ended up with the DVD. And I think that is a wonderful foundation and one that's worth watching over and over again. There's so much in President Clark's life that can fit not in a 30-minute, not in an hour, not in a 10-hour presentation. And so what I want to do today is share some things that I've learned about President Clark as I've studied his life. I'm going to focus in on 2 specific events, and it's not that I want you to know just more about 2 specific events in his life, but to hopefully cause you to think about ways and things you can draw lessons from, not only President Clark, but other role models that we have available to us. And I'm going to discuss 2 events in President Clark's life that are quite familiar in some ways, and many of you will be familiar with much of this, but there are a few things that I want to draw out of them. And both of them involve memoranda written by J. Reuben Clark. I begin, as you think about the Clark Memorandum, with one that will be obvious to most. I have here a copy of the original Clark Memorandum. Now, some of the younger ones in the room may not realize that the Clark Memorandum did not start with this high-quality publication that you get, that Scott Cameron does such a magnificent job with. And those who are a little older may not realize that it was not Paul Warner as a student, and Paul did start the original Clark Memorandum as a student newspaper at the law school in 1973 or 74. But the original, there really was a Clark Memorandum. The official title of it is Memorandum to the Secretary of the State on the Monroe Doctrine, prepared by J. Reuben Clark, Jr. And that's where the Clark Memorandum comes from. It consists of 17 pages. The cover letter, what most people call the Clark Memorandum, consists of 17 pages. There is an appendix that is 236 pages long. And there's some learning, I won't elaborate too much on this lesson, but there's some learning from that says something about J. Reuben Clark. That was typical of President Clark. The Monroe Doctrine was enunciated in 1823. His discussion of it begins with colonial times and talks about the King William's War, I don't even know what that is, in 1689, laying the groundwork to discuss the Monroe Doctrine from there. This was written in 1928 at a time when J. Reuben Clark, Jr. was the Undersecretary of State. By that time, he had served his stint as assistant solicitor and solicitor of State Department, had gone off into private practice, come back as a legal advisor to Dwight Morrow, who was the ambassador to Mexico. And he left Mexico in 1828, he'd been temporarily there, to take this position. The immediate cause or the immediate need for this Clark Memorandum on the Monroe Doctrine was that Secretary Kellogg, Secretary of State Kellogg, had just returned from entering into a treaty with about 14 other nations, the so-called Kellogg-Briand Treaty. And those of you who are really history buffs, and you have to be really history buffs to know this, may be familiar with that. It was a treaty in which nations agreed that they would outlaw war. It came on the heels of the failure of the League of Nations, but the thought was we really ought to do something after World War I, and most European nations signed this treaty. And the thought was, at the time, anything dealing with foreign policy, obviously the treaty had to be ratified, but a key issue at the time was the Monroe Doctrine had taken on what some have called a mythic aura about it. Anything dealing with foreign affairs, the first question that would come from the Senate is, what does the Monroe Doctrine have to say about this? Well, now we have to go back in time a little bit. What is the Monroe Doctrine? Monroe Doctrine was enunciated by President Monroe in 1823, and in a nutshell, this is quoting from it, the most pertinent language said, "The American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintained, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by a European power." I mean, it was sort of dividing this line between Europe and the Americas, and said that the United States would act as a threat to their own interests if there was European intervention. The problem, that wasn't a problem for this particular treaty, the problem was the so-called Roosevelt Corollary, which Theodore Roosevelt was famous for, which indicated that the U.S., under the Monroe Doctrine, would intervene in Latin America whenever a situation seemed so unstable that it might provoke European action. Now, how that had been interpreted is, if those familiar with history know that what happened is the United States was involved a whole lot in Latin America with military intervention around from about 1906 with President Roosevelt all through the 1920s. And the justification for that was that they were just enforcing the Monroe Doctrine. That is, if things got so unstable in these Latin American countries, surely the Europeans would get involved, and to prevent that from happening, the United States was itself justified in using military force in these Latin American countries. And the problem from the standpoint of policy with the Kellogg-Briand Treaty, which says we're outlawing war and military intervention, is there seemed to be a Roosevelt corollary that said we're going to intervene anytime we think the situation's unstable in any country. And so it was with that task that Secretary Kellogg asked J. Reuben Clark to prepare this document. It was a simple task in some ways because he was preparing it in anticipation of a Senate hearing. And he just wanted to be able to have this filed away. There was no intent of coming up of condemning all intervention. In fact, one of the things that is sort of ironic and one of the lessons is here, J. Reuben Clark himself had been very involved in many instances in which intervention had happened, particularly in Nicaragua in the 1910 and 1912, and then on with Mexico as well. But he was making those decisions and, in essence, sending the troops in. One of the things that happened, so he gets what seems to be a relatively uninteresting assignment. Prepare this little memorandum on how we can get around this Roosevelt corollary so we can say something to the Senate about this so they'll ratify the treaty. He in fact assigned it to one of his assistants, a woman named Anna O'Neill. She did much of the work gathering the materials in the appendix. He in fact told her what he wanted was every instance in which a president or a secretary of the state had talked about or invoked the Monroe Doctrine. That's the 236-page appendix that's there. But something happened as he started to prepare it. It seemed to sort of, as his biographer Frank Fox said, it seemed to sort of trigger something in him. He'd been thinking about the intervention the United States had been making. And midway through this, he has a conversation with one of his colleagues in the office that he records and said, "I told this individual that sometimes mistakes were made in looking merely for the strong points of our side instead of the weak points. I told him that I felt we had dealt between nations, that when we dealt between nations, we must always look for the weak points in order to make sure that there were no mistakes." And then he started to think about the mistakes, and he said, "I think it was a mistake, we made a mistake in the Barco matter in Colombia in intervening."